I think I might start off with a big question. So Noel, you had a photo up. I think was it Lord Londonderry? The photo. So talking about 100 years ago and then talking about today. I just want to pose a big question just to get us all chatting. What would you like to see the education landscape look like in, I won't say 100 years because we don't know what that's going to be, but say maybe 20 years from now? So that can be anything from high level policy, government decisions, right down to kind of one-to-one teacher, educator, student kind of relationship. What would you like to see in 20 years' time improve from now? That's open to anyone who wants to jump in.
Will I start with that one?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it's very hard to know because the wish list is so long, and you've heard fantastic wish lists from all the speakers really this evening in terms of where we want to go. But I think one of the things that we heard quite a lot over the last year when we engaged with hundreds of educationalists and parents and pupils and so on was around funding and the sustainability of funding for initiatives in Northern Ireland. And so in 20 years' time, I would like to think that some of the things that are being recommended now would receive funding, but not for 6 months or not for 12 months or not for 18 months, but actually for 10 or 20 years. And that would be a remarkable shift in policy and practice for Northern Ireland. There have been some fantastic initiatives that have been rolled out over the last 5, 10, 15 years in Northern Ireland, but so many of them were curtailed by the lack of funding. And we have heard repeatedly from school leaders and teachers across Northern Ireland that just when they got going on an initiative and just when they got going on a program, the funding stopped. So funding is key. I mean, I know I mentioned that as one of my priorities, but really a government commitment to sustained funding, which is apolitical, because I think too often party politics gets meshed in with education in Northern Ireland. And I think that's often very unhelpful. So sustained funding and investment in education, I think, is key. And I appreciate that during a pandemic is not the time to ask for more money for anything. But really, if we're serious about education, if we're serious about early years, if we're serious about special educational needs and emotional health and well-being and all those issues that have been raised by the speakers tonight, and about restoring equilibrium after COVID and so on, then we need to get serious about investing money. COVID has taught us another thing, and that is that actually there is money to be found when there's a great enough priority placed on something. And I'm not comparing, what we have to a pandemic, but at the same time, it showed us that actually, when push comes to shove, if government and public want something to happen badly enough, money will always be found. And so it's a case of priorities. And I think I would want to see in 10 or 20 years that educational funding receives the attention and the long-term sustained commitment that it deserves.
Anyone else want to jump in after that? Just anything you think down the line that you would really like a bit more focus in, whether that's funding or just a change, maybe a change in how it's thought about or approached, even at a school level.
Sorry, Tony, are you going to go?
Okay, I kind of, the first thing I wrote down when Noel was speaking, and what I've been really pleased to see happen during all of this, is that at last in Northern Ireland and across the UK and much further afield, we are at last talking about educational purpose. Rather than tactics, we are at last really, I think, beginning to think long term and say, what do we want from our education system? And we've held about 25 focus groups now across both books. And we finish each focus group and all the one-to-one interviews with a kind of double question, which is we invite people to take themselves back to February 2020. And we say, what can't you wait to get back to in terms of your classrooms, your staff rooms, your schools, right? What can't you wait to get back to? And what can't you wait to leave behind? Because if we don't have the courage to leave anything behind, we won't have the space to act on the fabulous innovation of this period. And we have to. So my hope is that in 20 years' time, we look at various things, I don't know which they'll be, and we'll say, in that awful pandemic, this was one of half a dozen really good things that came out of it. I hope we won't have just re-established the system we had, because if we do, we'll be going back and settling for all of the gaps in attainment and participation and everything else that was evident long before COVID came along in almost every developed education system. So that's kind of my hope, but I'm not sure I know what the 20 would be. Yes, I have my own hobby horses, but I'll keep them. I'll keep them for now.
Yeah. Well, Corinne, are you?
Yeah, and I've just noticed Alistair has put something into the chat, which I actually was going to say. So I think there are a lot of COVID keeps. I think there are things that we have all realised, like, why did we do that? And it's because that's just the way it's always been. So whilst Lord Londonderry may have been the education minister 100 years ago, there were things that we were still doing 100 years on. And possibly if it hadn't have been for that paradigm shift in pedagogy and instant reflection and practice, you know, we may still be doing them and we wouldn't have known another way. And I suppose my main hope is that we as educationalists start to get more involved with research and understand that there are safe spaces to be innovative and creative moving on, and that we maybe explore more things around some of those COVID keeps. So for instance, outdoor play, encouraging children and young people to socialise in a different way, encouraging them to get involved in sports and creative arts, and to really develop them into very well-rounded young people. I obviously am coming now with the headspace of curriculum and assessment, and I suppose the main thing that I want to encourage is the full immersion in skills within our curriculum, and to encourage all of us to really refocus into the Northern Ireland curriculum. It's a great curriculum, and there is much to be gained from really immersing ourselves in pedagogical practice. But I think there are lots of things that we do want to hold on to, and some of the things that we're letting go of, we have realised through, in a sense, a very good piece of action-based research that there's no more need for it and there is a better way forward. So just finding those moments where we can be creative and innovative, and maybe in 20 years' time, we'll look back and think, I wouldn't have kept that either. So I think it's an exciting time. And as Michelle McElveen said, you know, it's an opportunity to embrace something new in education. And I think that is something that we all want to embrace.
If you are listening and you want to add into the chat, just what you would like to see in 20 years' time in the education landscape, drop it in there and we'll read those out as well. Lisa, I'm really interested in terms of what you've done with Teachers Collaborate, and you must have learned so much through that process and been surprised by it. Are there things you think can be spread beyond, you know, your group itself to maybe the wider education sector that you've learned, that maybe that the lessons that you could bring forward into the next 20 years, next decade?
Yeah, well, I hope that the group has given teachers a voice in Northern Ireland. You know, Celia talked in her video about us being heart people, but my experience of all teachers in Northern Ireland is that they're heart people, and we want the best for the weans, as I would call them, that are in front of us, you know. And I work with some of those children that Dr. Purdy is talking about, those most disadvantaged children who are underachieving. And so I just hope that we are seeing the value of working together across all sectors, special schools, post-primary, primary schools, Irish medium schools, that actually as a collective, as a collaboration, teachers of today can make a big change in the education system of tomorrow. So I really hope that's the big takeaway for people, and for those who are making policy in Northern Ireland, that we look at how we can do it together.
And I think, Elisa, I think that and it's been mentioned this evening, that new level of empathy between the home and the school, because actually literally through things like Zoom, you know, we have peered into each other's home says it word. Some of that's quite uncomfortable. But actually, I think, I'm not sure what the situation was in Northern Ireland, but certainly in England, in the first lockdown, schools were criticised for struggling to connect with the most disadvantaged. In the second lockdown, second substantive lockdown, actually, we connected, I think, extremely well with a lot of those families and built some really positive relationships. And in fact, one of the conundrums that came out of it was that some of the so-called vulnerable children that were in school during the second lockdown became anxious when they knew everybody else was coming back, because for the first time in their educational careers, they were in the small groups and they had the kind of attention that they'd craved and they'd needed. So one of our challenges is to sustain some of that. But the new relationships we have with at least some of those families has to be a positive. But I'd love us to see us drop the term vulnerable, because, one reason why we know families didn't send their children in the first lockdown was it was a public admission of being vulnerable. It was like being asked to queue up separately for free school meals in the 70s. We need to get a bit more emotionally sensitive, I think, about how we do that stuff.
Can I come in there and just say that the research that we did here in Northern Ireland, a homeschooling survey, showed huge differences as well between the first lockdown, March to June 2020, compared to January to March 2021. And certainly, we know, don't we, that teachers were much more confident in using online technology by the time of the second lockdown. And parents reported that their children were generally spending more time online, although it differed between school types here in Northern Ireland. And we looked at different school types, and we found that, for example, grammar schools, the pupils there spent longer in live lessons than perhaps in non-selective schools and in primary schools. So much so that in some cases, and interestingly, I've just been supervising a master's dissertation with a teacher who worked in a grammar school or works in a grammar school, who found as well that some pupils were spending literally all day on a screen. Now, I know teachers often spend all day on a screen, and I don't think it's healthy for either teachers or pupils. But so things were much better in terms of the motivational element that came from live teaching, which was definitely more common in the second lockdown. But I think a balance, actually, if and please God, we'll never have to do this again, but if we ever did have to have some sort of a lockdown or a circuit breaker or whatever, that there would need to be a balance, because we really don't want our children, I don't want my children, and one or two of them were, sitting on a screen from 9 o'clock in the morning to 3:30 in the afternoon. Now, in some ways, okay, there was live teaching, it was motivating, but really, do we really want our children to be sitting looking at a screen? And from a teacher's well-being perspective either, do we want our teachers to be sitting looking at a screen from 9 to 3:30? So a balance, I think, is important, but definitely the second lockdown was a more pedagogically digitally competent lockdown in many ways than the first one.
Yeah. We've had some comments there about the next sort of 20 years. Shauna said we need a fully funded certified acknowledgement and statutory TPL provision TPL provision to celebrate teachers' collaboration and research informed practice to validate our pedagogical practices. We have another one saying hubs where community health and education come together, allowing us to more speedily meet the needs of those most vulnerable children. And Anna said the scramble for devices, etc., was a disaster. Every pupil should have access to affordable technology, and that has to be a priority going forward. And she said that was mentioned again on Monday night. And really, that to me seems like a kind of a very acute problem at the minute, and something. I just wanted to open up about those kind of the attainment gaps that exist between different groups. Do you think that the digital divide is going to amplify that? Do you think going forward after COVID, is it going to be the same groups that will be naturally disadvantaged, or is there going to be different people because of different learning styles, or how do you think the new landscape will affect learners in a sense?
I think we have to realise that a number of young people, and I can see somebody's put it into the chat, did actually really thrive in a lockdown scenario. And, you know, it is a bit of like horses for courses. You know, certain children will suit certain styles. And for some, it actually probably not having the social contact, not having some of those anxiety moments where you're walking into assembly, it's really loud, or, you know, was actually really helpful. What I would say in terms of digital, I think that we have a very bright future because we actually have a very good platform in Northern Ireland. I'm not saying it's perfect, but we do have a platform where, if you remember my previous talk last year, we were able to take off really quickly with online and remote learning because we had a good network. We had a system where all pupils had equity of access. However, the problem actually was in terms of that digital divide and in terms of our Wi-Fi. And in the Fair Start report, one of the things that particularly interested me was that focus on access of network in terms of the Wi-Fi, because that actually cut down children's accessibility in terms of online learning. It wasn't suitable that many young people were learning on a mobile phone, or perhaps they'd only had one laptop for a household. And I think there are issues that do need explored. It's maybe not for education. It is maybe in terms of the Department of Economy and Finance, communities. It has to be cross-cutting in terms of departmental work to ensure that everybody in Northern Ireland has access to a new digital world. And I think there are great learning opportunities. You've heard brilliant examples from Lisa's group and others, you know, who are just lighting up the world with what they're doing. They're innovative, they're creative, they're trying new things. We're seeing examples of automate AI in terms of marking and automated marking, and, you know, really looking at teacher workload. So there are ways that we can use technology to advance. However, I have to say, going back to Tony's comment about socialization, you know, it has to be a digital first, but maybe a digital, not digital only as we move forward. And that power of human connection is still something that I think we have to really value. And, you know, a teacher shapes a life. It's not a robot or a computer. And they recognize and name the good things that young people have and can come into school with. So I'm a bit like Noel. Whilst I really value technology, I think teachers bring so much more into the classroom and learning experience. But I do think it's an issue around our infrastructure, and the provision has to be there on a wider platform. And I think that's for a different discussion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, some of the research we did at Stranmillis exposed not just digital poverty in the sense of not being able to afford a device, but rural isolation in terms of the broadband issues in rural communities and isolated rural communities, and stories of pupils who were, you know, walking across a field or half a mile down a lane to try and get a signal so that they could, you know, post their homework or whatever it is. And you know, we did make a recommendation in the Fair Start report around improving digital access. You know, we learned about the Project Stratum, which is the executive programme to improve digital access right across Northern Ireland. And we are aware that that's a hugely costly endeavour that the executive is committed to, but it's crucially important. So it's not just about those low-income families. It's actually families who may not be particularly low income, but live in an isolated area, who don't have access. But at the same time, there were many positives, and we shouldn't forget that, you know, many community groups and indeed statutory authorities did provide a lot of devices. Schools went out of their way to try and either provide devices, lending out devices, or even just printing out resources for families that they knew couldn't access those resources. So, you know, I think the community in Northern Ireland, you know, deserves a lot of credit for what they did in very difficult circumstances, particularly in those really, you know, fearful weeks at you know, March and April of 2020, when we really didn't know what we were about to head into. But moving forward, you know, clearly there are issues not just around poverty and devices, but broadband right across Northern Ireland, particularly in rural areas.
I'd remind as well, there's the BBC scheme, BBC Give a Laptop, which is working directly with business in the community in Northern Ireland, and they're able to help where they can, donations of laptops and things like that. I wanted to highlight, there was a comment from, I think it's Eel, which is just, it was lovely. My son suffers from crippling anxiety and has struggled with being in school. During lockdown, he was very positively thrived with online learning, and this has allowed him to catch up with his peers. Now he's confidently working through year 11 with very much improved attendance, and his anxiety has significantly reduced. Online learning is a fabulous way to support our anxious children going forward. So that's a brilliant example of the opportunities there to support diverse range of learners as well. I just wanted, Alistair left a question there, which I thought was interesting. What is the future of assessment post-COVID? How can or should we be reimagining exams and assessments?
Well, I've kind of, I in a previous life was a chief examiner at GCSE and did a lot of examining at A level and all the rest of it. And I routine, if you want to make me furious, just use the term grade inflation, because we didn't actually have grade inflation. We had grading spikes caused by particular circumstances. But also just bear in mind that if we applied the logic of norm reference into the driving test, we just fail a number of people every year because we could only let a certain number pass. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why, teachers have been through this incredible and very arduous teacher assessment process. And it's been difficult because all of those elements of examining have been progressively abolished over the last 10 or 15 years. And I think the reason why those grades have gone up is not because of teacher subjectivity or some notion of grade inflation, however it happens. It's because these young people, although they haven't been examined for, an hour and a half or 3 hours or X number of papers in an exam hall, they've actually been examined in a much wider range of ways than they ordinarily are. And that seems to me that we have created more opportunities for different kinds of learner and different kinds of children to succeed. And we should, it seems to me that what ought to be getting our head around is that actually, I do believe there's a place for written papers and all the rest of it, but I'd like to see a much wider range of assessment models. And I'd also like to see us get away from the domination of a single kind of examination at 16, because 10 GCSEs is not breadth, it's 10 variations on a theme. And that every young person should do some professional and vocational learning, and be assessed differently for that. We shouldn't be leaving the vocational learning for those who've fallen off the academic ladder, so that you fall onto the vocational curriculum rather than choose it. So I think around assessment and curriculum, we really need to use this opportunity to think differently. But I actually think the better grades are because actually we've seen a greater number of young people show their talent. And that means our pre-lockdown system was wasting a lot of talent. So let's find a way of going forward with that. Sorry, a bit of a hobby horse. But...
No, that's okay. I was wondering, does anyone else have any thoughts about the assessment? Because I always have a thought of, we're trying to improve education, and then once grades improve, there seems to be suspicion that maybe you're not getting better at our jobs or anything.
Damned if we do and damned if we don't.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any thoughts about exams or assessments in general?
I'll just come in very, very briefly and agree with Tony that I think, in so many ways, the last couple of years has given us an opportunity to reflect on the fundamentals that we thought were unshakable about how we do education. And assessment is only one of many of those previously unshakable, or what looked like unshakable sort of bastions of how we do education. So, children lined up in exam halls, sitting examinations that are externally assessed and so on. And we've moved away from that. Who would have thought 2 years ago, if anybody had suggested that we would have 2 years without external assessments, you would have laughed. You just wouldn't have believed it. It's such a good opportunity to have, and I think that already we're being sucked back into the way things used to be. I remember at the end of the first lockdown, Corinne and I and some others were on webinars that were run across Northern Ireland, where there was so much blue sky thinking. You know, we were gonna reinvent education. We were gonna look at how things are done, and we were gonna learn the lessons and move forward. And already we're beginning to see things just slipping back to the way things were in the past. You know, so certainly let's look at assessment. You know, I love Alistair's question. Let's look at assessment. If we've got the time, let's have a fundamental review of how we assess our children, not just at 16, but why don't we look in Northern Ireland at how we assess them at 11? I know that's very provocative, but we have a transfer test at 11 that didn't run. Who would have thought that that wouldn't have run last year? And did the world end? Well, some people probably think it did, and other people might not. But, you know, it's an opportunity is what I'm saying, without being too controversial, to at least look at what happened, to look at the impact of that, and to see whether that's the kind of future that we want for our children, for our primary children. I'm a parent of a child who went through the transfer process last year, who thought they were doing an exam, and then in the end, it was postponed and eventually cancelled. You know, so I'm speaking professionally and personally. Let's look at the system and have a proper review and not waste the opportunity that Tony has mentioned.
I think everybody is making really valid points, and I suppose part of my role is to think around some of those issues about assessment and reimagining assessment. But let's also look at actually what we have in terms of the Northern Ireland curriculum in terms of assessment, and how we actually should be looking at the journey of assessment. You know, unfortunately in Northern Ireland, we maybe do focus a lot on outcome at 16 and 18, but we actually do need to look at other benchmarks within the system where we can actually critically screen children and really put in supports and help for them when they need it. We are spending a lot of money in the system with external providers, and we maybe need to look at, you know, how that money could be changed and repurposed. So I do think we do need to refocus on assessment. But I suppose the challenge is getting those conversations started. And I suppose things like this are only the start of that. And I think, you know, moving forward, there is an opportunity, and it is good that the minister acknowledges that there's an opportunity. No system should only have a benchmark at 16 and 18. And unfortunately, that's where we are. But there is an opportunity here to reimagine and think about, you know, that refocus on curriculum and on assessment in Northern Ireland. And I'm sure I'm going to bring Lisa in here, because as a teacher, she is assessing every day. You know, it just doesn't happen in May or June. It happens every day. Wouldn't that be right, Lisa?
It is indeed, Corinne. I've spent the last week doing assessments because we're just about to give our first parental feedback on the first return for the first 6 weeks. So yeah, it's an ongoing process, and it was lovely last year as a teacher to have your professional judgment valued, and I think it was very much valued by the parents and the pupils and their parents. And I hope in the future that the teacher has a bit more of an input into a final grade or whatever way we're going to assess children.
Well, this is Optimistic October, and I suppose all of us need to start to be a bit more optimistic about the future. And I think if you listen to the conversations that have been ongoing, and Noel and I do get the opportunity to engage in quite a lot of deep pedagogical chat, and it is exciting that there are a number of people who are really passionate about young people and making sure that they get to be wherever they're supposed to be. So whether that is a truly academic or a vocational route, that those options are open to them. And I think we do have to look right at our very earliest little humans who come into school and think, right, this is an opportunity for them. And the legacy that we create is actually reimagining what assessment looks like right from the start. And if we were in Finland, you know, a number of our children would already be through critical screeners at 7, where they get the opportunity to identify those children with learning difficulties. So, you know, there are other jurisdictions doing other things that are slightly different to us. And we do need to look at all types of assessment, diagnostic, evaluative. You know, we do need to get a better handle on things. And this is a great opportunity. And I'm sure myself and colleagues back in SAIL will really welcome and embrace those challenges.
David, I don't know if it's a kind of pertinent and worrying statistic, and this is going back 5 or 6 years, so I don't know if it still holds, but I can't think why it would have changed. But a statistic applying to English secondary schools was that 5 or 6 years ago, they spent more on examination entry fees than anything except staffing. So that's all resource input together. That's, you know, everything in the budget. After staffing, the biggest expense was exam fees. Now, it just seems to me, and I am not at all anti-exam, and I think there should be a mix of different types of assessment and all the rest of it. But if that is your biggest expense in the system, then, and if money is meant to follow priorities, then we've got something a bit wrong. We've got something a bit out of kilter. And I know that if my exams had been cancelled when I was 16, we'd have had parties in the street. And what we had instead was we had children thinking, my exams have cancelled, what am I going to do? Now, you know, in my time in the classroom, I tried to spend my time getting children to worry a bit about their exams, but maybe that pendulum has swung a bit too far. And maybe, as in all sorts of other ways, this can be part of a great rebalancing and focusing, as Noel said at the outset, around purpose. And you know, Corinne, you talked about you can't build from an empty bucket. Well, Lisa's shown just how full the bucket is in Northern Ireland. It's fantastic. You've got a great foundation. I think we might come and ask, can we borrow a bucket off you now and then? But, you know, we've got to take some optimism out of this, because that's the only way we'll make progress.
Well, I think that's probably a good point to end on. We're just running out of time. So thank you very much for everyone. That's it for this year's Digital TeachMeet. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you've gained some new insights and perspectives and tips over the last couple of days and got a chance to connect with one another. All these talks will be available on the BBC Northern Ireland YouTube channel over the next few days, definitely by next week. Thank you so much to our panelists tonight, to Dr. Noel Purdy, to Corinne Latham, Lisa Morrison, and Dr. Tony Breslin. And thank you so much for tuning in tonight and for tuning in all week. And I hope you have a very good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Bye.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye now.
All right.